Now then, carrying on with John's Gospel, John 8, 1 to 11. Then everyone went home, but Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. Early the next morning, he went back to the temple. All the people gathered round him and sat down and began to teach them. He began to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught committing adultery. And they made her stand before them all. Teacher, they said to Jesus, this woman was caught in the very act of committing adultery. In our law, Moses commanded that such a woman must be stoned to death. Now, what do you say? They said this to trap Jesus, so that they could accuse him. But he bent over and wrote on the ground with his finger. As they stood there asking him questions, he straightened himself up and said to them, whichever one of you has committed no sin may throw the first stone at her. Then he bent over again and wrote on the ground. When they heard this, they all left one by one, the older ones first. And Jesus was left alone with the woman still standing there. He straightened himself up and said to her, where are they? Is there no one left to condemn you? No one, sir, she answered. Well then, Jesus said, I do not condemn you either. Go, but do not sin again. This is always a great passage for me, and because in my job, I'm trained to always be right. And if people don't agree, to be angry about it on the inside. I'm also trained to be diplomatic and smile. But actually, this is a great for all of you, all of us, who get caught up in heat situations, where there's a sense of pressure, where somebody else is clearly wrong, and where something needs to be said. A few chosen words need to be chosen. And other people are around. There's a matter of status and keeping face and all sorts of things. There's sometimes a rush. There's sometimes a, come on, now let's do this. It's a hot moment. And things are said and things are done and verbal things are thrown, as you might say. This is always a good passage in teaching about this. It's also clearly, week in and week out, month in and month out, a great passage in dealing with the wider sense of the world's woes. Somebody was saying on the television this week, once everybody has stopped fighting in the Middle East who they are fighting, then they'll all start fighting one another. Because everybody in those kind of wars is right, and they shout about it, and they throw things about it, and whether it's for political or religious or ethnic or ideological reasons, everybody is right, and hard things are said, and it's a heat situation. But I think it's a particularly great passage at the moment in our nation, because faced with a series of disasters, whether it's terrorism, whether it's that fire in the Tower block, or faced with challenges that democracy brings in people voting for one thing or another, or whether it's a referenda or it's general elections or whatever it is, there's a great propensity at the moment for heat rather than light, for disasters to be turned into divisions, for disagreements to be turned into hatred, for a war against terror to be turned into a class war. And so there's a huge sense of anger and things being said and people being shouted at and all sorts of things. And you think there's a great heat in our society. It's a good passage for this, because Jesus is in a hot situation. Not only is he surrounded by the crowd, that's quite controversial, Jesus teaching in the temple precincts. There's the disciples, there's the crowd, there's the hangers-on, there's the supporters, there's the not very supporters. And then all these Pharisees who are very hot under the collar, they arrive with this woman. What a tense situation. She's actually been caught in adultery. The mind boggles. But anyway, she's been dragged off the bed and brought into the temple where women weren't supposed to be and stood before them and accused And there is a tense situation, and they're saying, look, the law of Moses says she should be stoned, so what do you say? And there's also the politics, because if you say she should be stoned, that is against the Roman law, which doesn't allow it. But if you say she's not to be stoned, that's against the Mosaic law, so you're not kosher. This is a bad moment. Perhaps in our point of view, we're looking at Jesus and we're saying, if you say she should be stoned, isn't that the heart of God, a stony heart? But if you say she shouldn't be stoned, well, God was letting everybody off in the end, really is a big softie. It's one of those situations where I'm thinking, I'm so glad Jesus has to deal with this and not me. I really am. But it's a situation where we can really hear what happens. Because what he does, first of all, we have a pause. We have a pause. In fact, most of the story is pause. He breaks eye contact, because one of the things with a row is eye contact. Eyeballing somebody. He cuppets down on the ground, out of eye contact, right? And he just stops and dibbles in the dirt. This is not Jesus prevaricating, I would have. This is not Jesus putting it off, I would have done that. This is not Jesus not knowing what to say, I would have thought that. This is not what we call these days displacement activity, all right? This is a pause. And it's a pause in a really stressful situation which has to be created. It's not, oh, nothing else is happening at the moment. This is a real pause that's actually created. He does it. This is his decision. This is his response. To do, well, nothing. To just pause. It's not a long pause. It's not, he says, friends, let's all go for a day's retreat in the hills. It's just perhaps a minute. And neither is it a nothing happening sort of pause. It's a pause to reflect. I've never been very good at electronics, really. I'm okay in the lab, but I'm not any good in the home. But if you're watching a DVD on your DVD player and somebody comes to the door and it's going to be a major interruption, for many years I used to turn it off. And then when they'd gone, you had to try and find it all again because it had gone blank. You see, these days, because I'm advanced, I press pause. And the picture stays on the screen. Amazing, the guy's there when you get back. This is this sort of pause. Jesus doesn't say, oh, time out, let's not think about anything, let's just... But there's a reflection time here. It's a positive thing. I think this is tremendous. How many things go wrong in the world and in our lives because there is no pause at the heated moment? It doesn't matter whether it is dear old Trump tweeting. This guy could start a third world war with a tweet because he's having a bad night. You think, oh, straight back. But how many people get into problems with replies to emails? Reply, boom, or whatever they call it. Was it Facebook? That's it. All right? And when you suddenly move somebody from your list of friends to your list of enemies, boom, how dare you say this, Go straight back. You remember the old days? Do you remember the old days when somebody used to write you a letter? And then, I've done this a long time ago. I haven't written letters for ages, really, where you could let forth and scribble off a reply, but there wasn't a postal collection till tomorrow, so you read it again and then threw it away and then wrote another letter. I've done that. And how much better that was. To pause from the heat of the moment. Jesus, I said, I want to pause. I think we need to do that. But it's a spiritual activity, because to create a pause is not, as I say, not having anything else to do. It is a thing you have to create. It is a strong pause. It is a full pause. He cuppers down there and the tension is palpable. He's holding back and they're going on. But what is he challenging them to do? Is he challenging them to reflect. Just reflect. And he calls them to reflect on two things. First of all, in the middle of the pause, he says, any of you who are without sin. So just reflect on yourself in the heat of the situation. Now, this is not means that no judge has to be absolutely perfect. And if they can't, they can't make a judgment. That's not true. Most of our high court judges are not convicted murderers. But that doesn't mean that a high court judge can't make a judgment on murder but be an imperfect person. He's saying to those Pharisees, look, just reflect on how you are. That doesn't mean that you've committed adultery. It doesn't mean you're the worst people in the world. But hey, just look at yourselves. In reflection to me, not the woman. I know you're better than the woman, perhaps. But before God, look at your sin. Just reflect on how you are and your imperfections. That's a hugely helpful thing. You don't have to be draconian. We are not the worst people in the world. When you've got people like Moses and Peter and Paul, they make judgments. They are not perfect people. But I reckon if you read the Pauline letters or the pastoral epistles from Peter, these are written by men that when they admonish people, when they put people right, when they sort the church out, Peter will remember that he denied Jesus. Paul will remember that he was there at the stoning of Stephen. And I think if we will pause and just remember that I might be tremendously right about this, but I'm not perfect. I have my real imperfections. I feel there's a sense of deflation, like a balloon going down, you know? And I'm thinking, yeah, okay. So, anybody who's not sinned, any of you, reflect on that. And then reflect on what you're going to do. You throw the first stone. Jesus does not downplay this. He doesn't say, look, I think we ought to just give her a good telling off. He doesn't say, well, just take her to court. Or he doesn't say just fine her. He doesn't just say anything. He sticks with the stones. He sticks with the hardness of what they're about to do. Throw the first stone. It's a sense in which he's saying, you reflect on what you're actually going to do. You're very hot on throwing the stone, but you just think about where it'll land. Do you really want that? Anyway, do you really want that to happen just because you want to make a political point about me? Just think. Reflect on what you're going to do. You want to throw the first stone. I know that's hugely helpful, isn't it? If I'm going to reflect on not how do I feel about saying this, but how will this land? When people, in my church history, people have said, or they've said before I've got there sometimes, in a meeting, in the heat of the moment, I resign. Do you really want to leave? Really? I'm never coming here again. Really? Well, I'm never speaking to so-and-so again. Really? I'll have absolutely nothing to do with them. Really? I've met people in later life who never got out of that hole and could never wind back that because they were keen on throwing the stone and didn't think about where it would land. And some of those stones turned out to be boomerangs, to be honest. Just think. Just reflect. Do you want to throw the stone? Jesus says, I want you to pause. I want you to reflect on who you are, just very briefly. And I want to reflect on what you're going to do. But then finally he says, from this passage, you've got to listen to what I've got to say. This is not sort of a TUC cooling off phase. This is not let's all just be a bit grown up about this. This is a space to hear what Jesus has to say into the situation. Now, you could say the people in the crowd who are listening to Jesus are in a much better shape than the Pharisees that turn up in the heat of the moment, because they're listening to the teaching of Jesus. When we are in a heat situation, we cannot say, time out, I'm going to go and do a Bible study. That is not going to work, So we need to be taught by Jesus all the time in a background, so that, in fact, we have the background knowledge of what Jesus would do, the basis of Jesus' heart. We need to be genned up, we need to be in good shape, so when it kicks in, we are already well prepared. But in specific situations, we need a word of conviction, a word of knowledge, a bit of guidance. What does Jesus have to say here and now? And he said it then and there. And what does he say? We come back to Kate was mentioning mercy. We see here that Jesus speaks of the Father heart of God. He has a huge will to love. The real cliche from this passage, which I've heard preached many times, is Jesus did not condemn nor condone. It's such a cliche, it kind of rolls out of your life, doesn't it? It's not strong, that. It's true, but it's... Basically, he seeks to forgive her. He said, I don't condemn you. Let's put that to one side. Now, that's extraordinary, because there is no, as far as we know, repentance at this point. There could be a lot of remorse. I wish I wasn't here and I wish I hadn't been caught. But there is no sign of repentance. But Jesus just forgives her, as he has the authority to do. That's enough. And then he says, don't do it again. There is a huge firmness here. There is indeed a condemnation of the act. There's a judgment. He says, we're not doing that anymore. Don't do it. And those two things, that warmth and love and that firmness, come together in the grace of God. He's not an old softy, but he's not hard-hearted. Brings it together. And there's a new world there, isn't there? She has a new beginning. We are called, when we are in a heat situation, or when as often we are part of a family or a little group around a coffee table or at work, where it's bubbling up, we are called to pause, to reflect, and to listen. We are called to imitate Jesus with his grace and his forgiveness, but his firmness. I think only God can help us with that. But I also think that if those Pharisees hadn't pushed off, they'd have been there to hear him say it. The woman hears him, the crowd hear him, the disciples hear him, but all the Pharisees are pushed off in a huff. But if they'd waited, what would have Jesus said to them? Perhaps Jesus would have said to them, and after all that anger and bitterness and hatred and all that, I don't condemn you for that. Don't do it again, lads. You know? I need to hear that as well as do it. In the moment of your heat, in the moment of our anger, in the moment of just inside us, we need to wait to hear Jesus say, I don't condemn you, just don't do it again. That we are healed, just as the woman was healed. But we wait and we hear. I think at the end of the passage where Jesus talks to her, that's one of those really magic bits in Jesus' life where amongst all the crowd and all the chaos and all the other things, it appears to be at that one moment as if she is the one person existing in the universe. You get that a bit with the woman with the bleeding, with all the crowds jostling in, and he talks to her. And those words he says to her is as if she is the only person there. Jesus has a tremendous talent, if you like, to speak to us as if we were the only person there is at that key moment. And this morning I want you to feel that he speaks to you amongst all of us and amongst a tumultuous world as if you're the only person around. We can say, Lord, where I feel heat in my life, where I see tension moments coming up in this week, I pray that I should pause, reflect, and show your grace. But I pray, Lord, that I should pause, reflect, and hear your grace, your love and your firmness. I don't condemn you. Don't do it again. The band are just going to come and play for us as we come to communion. It speaks about the Lord's tenderness, which is not soft and is bought at an enormous price. There's nothing soft about the cross. Grace is dearly bought.